I'm going to start with a quote which is helpful in sort of framing some of the issues that I think have arisen in managing an increasingly global economic system in a world in which sovereignty and political power ultimately rests with nation states. And that was a big theme of my book on globalization. I was very aware that this was a fundamental issue, how a global economic system with activity integrated largely through markets relates to a political system which is clearly and profoundly non-global, where states, be they democracies or otherwise, feel responsibility for their own citizens, not for those of the world. How do you manage that sort of system? And the answer, I think, has turned out to be with even greater difficulty than I thought when I was writing about that at length in Why Globalization Works. So the quote is, democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can combine any two of the three, but never have all three simultaneously in full. In other words, there are some real trade-offs when we start thinking about policy choices, and we start thinking about, above all, about who matters in economic decision making and to whom. So with that, this is what I'm going to do in this particular lecture. There are innumerable ways I could have done this, but this is the way I've decided to do it today. So I'm going to first talk about what's gone right in the last 40 years, and that's quite important. And then I'm going to talk about what's gone wrong, and particularly where it's gone wrong, which is pretty obviously, most obviously in the developed West. Then I'm going to talk about what that has meant for Western democracy and some of the stresses that have originated. And then I'm going to have a very brief discussion of some of the challenges. The last bit is where really all the policy debate and discussion should be, but I will end up with about 3 minutes of it because something had to go, and that's going to be another lecture. You can invite me back and I'll discuss what we can do about it all. So let's start off with triumph of global capitalism. So this is a chart which we took from a very useful analysis by the Bank for International Settlements, and it shows basically what's happened to the holdings of external cross-border holdings of financial assets and liabilities relative to world GDP, which is the reddish line, and you can read the scale on the left-hand side, and you can see that that part of the global market system exploded. Simply exploded from about 40% of GDP to 400% of GDP. I have not been able to use, because I simply don't have the time, the charts which compare this with, we have data on this sort of thing going back to the 19th century, but I can tell you, we know that nothing like this has ever happened before. This degree of openness of the financial system as measured by the stock of cross-border holdings of assets is unparalleled. And then after the financial crisis, this just stopped growing. Okay? It hasn't collapsed. Some parts of it did. Bank holdings of foreign assets, cross-border holdings by banks have diminished very substantially. Cross-border holdings of bonds have not, but so it's offset, it's to zero. The green line, which you can read on the right scale, is the same basic idea for trade, and again, the ratio of trade to GDP has roughly doubled over this period, and again, it has recently reached levels never seen before. That wasn't true back in the 70s, by the way. The openness of the world economy, as so measured in the period before the First World War, was actually higher than it was until well into the 80s. So we've had an incredibly large increase in openness as many economies around the world opened up, particularly emerging and developing countries. And since the crisis, this has stopped. It hasn't reversed, but it has stopped. Now, what has happened economically during this period of globalization, which for the first time really ever integrated much of the world economic system, much of the world into a single, not a single, into a market economic system among sovereign states. So the last time, what's sometimes called the first globalization, which is the late 19th, early 20th century, was of course in the context of empire. This is obviously fundamentally different because it's in the context of sovereign states, and that's very significant. So what's happened? Well, perhaps the most striking of all the things that have happened is shown in this chart. I do have charts that go back to 1820, but again, for lack of time, I won't be able to go into them. But so this is the World Bank's most recent evaluation of the proportion of the world's population that live under what their current absolute poverty line, which is measured as $1.90 a day in 2011 purchasing power, which roughly speaking is their estimate of how much you need to survive. It's subsistence minimum. It's sort of the destitution level. You're above the subsistence minimum, but not much. And the crucial point is back in 1981, which isn't so long ago, the proportion of the world's population living at such a desperately low level was 43%, and the most recent estimate is 10. Actually, the most recent estimate, which I don't have in this consistent data, is slightly below 10%. Now, to compare it, the data indicate, though of course they're much more guesswork, is that back in 1820, roughly 85% of all human beings lived off this level. But the point is it went from 85 to 40 over 150 years, and it's gone down from there to 10 in the subsequent, what is that, roughly 30 years. So this is surely a most astonishing achievement. The second big thing that happened in this period, very, very closely related to the first, was the staggering success of Asian emerging economies, not other emerging countries, but Asian emerging economies, in increasing their share in world GDP. And the two things are correlated because, of course, the largest decline in poverty by far was in China, and the second largest biggest decline by far was in India. I mean, you are all very educated people, so you understand that the population of China and India together is 2.5 times greater than that of all developed countries put together. So this is quite a big deal. So in this chart shows the shares of the world economy measured at purchasing power parity again. I've also got them in market prices. The major point is way back in 1980 or even in 1990, the developed countries, so this is the US, EU and the rest of the developed world, accounted for 60% of the world economy, thus measured. It's the best measure. And the rest of the world, the remaining 85% of all the people in the world, roughly, generated 40%. Over a period, a very short period of less than 30 years, or roughly 30 years, the developed country share has gone to 40%. This is completely new. It didn't happen after the Second World War at all. It's just happened in the era of globalization. And the growth is entirely, essentially, in China. India is immediately above it, and to a smaller degree, the rest of Asia. The other regions of the developing world, predominantly Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, have not grown faster than the developed world. So this is the core of that poverty success is here. Now, this is, I think, the single most interesting chart on world economic history that I know. So basically what it shows you is what has happened to global average incomes and their distribution since 1820. And it will bring out very startling what's happened between 1975 and 2015, which is the era of the global capitalism I am talking about. So the way to think of it is that each of the three graphs shows income per head distributed among the world population. It's obviously heroic guesswork, but well, the last two sets of data are much less than the heroic, the earlier period, because there's a lot of household income data. The rest of it is very clearly a lot of guesswork. Now, what is it telling you? This is a log scale of average daily income per capita, so it has all the normal properties of a log scale on all sides. What is it basically telling you? Well, first, the size of the distribution is proportional to world population, so there are an awful lot more people. Roughly speaking, there are about 7.5 times as many people as there were in 1800, as far as we know. Second, on average, the world has got much, much richer. So, as I said, nearly everybody was desperately poor in 1800. By 1975, we got considerably richer, and by 2015, the whole world has got very, very considerably richer. Average GDP per head in the world as a whole has risen, in the world as a whole, probably about 10 times since 1800. The second thing, the last and most important thing is to focus on the distribution. So between 1800 and 1975, the people living in the yellow zone, which is Europe, and the green zone, which is North America, basically North and South America, but it's predominantly North America, increased their incomes massively, and they became pretty well the total sum of all the wealthy people in the world. The red bit, which is Asia, had a very small number given the immense population of wealthy people. And at that point, GDP inequality across human beings reached its peak, as far as we know. Roughly then, that was the point at which the dispersion of income, the distribution of income became most unequal in the world. What has happened between 75 and 2015? Well, in the developed world, real incomes have continued to rise, but not that much. They have risen, but not that much. But the whole of Asia, to a much lesser degree the other regions, has shifted over to the right massively. And that reflects the dominant picture I've already told you, which was the extraordinary rise in real incomes in East and South Asia, above all in China and India. And as a result, during this period, for the first time since the early 19th century, the distribution of income among households across the world has become more equal. And that is essentially interestingly, as far as we can see, the distribution of income has become more unequal in almost all countries. But it has become less unequal in the world as a whole because of this astonishing effect of the average income explosion in Asia, which of course contains more than half of all the people in the world. So this chart, I think, indicates very, very powerfully what an extraordinary period this was for an immense number of human beings who don't happen to live in the West. Okay, so we think it's a miserable period, and lots of people think it was just great. So this is the triumph. This is a tremendous, colossal success. Having worked in the World Bank, and worked on trade and trade policy and globalization, this is what I hoped would happen. So I regard this as a success. Now, the final chart, I think, on the triumph of global capitalism, I want to show, which is something which I think is very, very interesting, and I'm trying to write about at the moment, is what has happened to the political system. So the blue line and the orange line is one set of estimates of, on a consistent basis, so there are two different sources, of the openness of the world economy measured on this scale, but it's the same scale basically. And it shows the openness rose in the late 19th century, collapsed in the interwar period in the Second World War, rose after the Second World War, had a long stasis as all the new countries went protectionist, and then this is absolute explosion of trade in the globalization period, which coincided with this staggering success in Asia. The red line shows the proportion of the world's countries. Of course, the number of countries has increased massively in the last 60 years because of decolonization, that are democracies, at least have reasonably competitive elections, and therefore some of the characteristics of democracy. And the remarkable thing is, after this rose at the same time as trade opened, it collapsed in the interwar period. It rose again immediately after the war, because a lot of the former fascist countries were made democracies. Then there's a long period of stasis, rather like trade, and it exploded up starting in the middle of the 70s, and we have lived through an incredible expansion in democracy across the world during this globalization era. And I think it's important to remember that, while recognizing that in the last 10 years we are clearly living, coinciding with the Great Recession, and not, I think, coincidentally, we're living through a period of what one expert calls the democratic recession, or at least the democratic stasis. So the globalization period coincided with a massive surge in the proportion of democracies in the world. They weren't perfect democracies, and a lot of them have slid backwards, but that remains the case. We have far higher proportion of the regimes in the world which have competitive elections of some kind than we have ever had before. And that also, I have to say, I regard as a great success, and I don't think it's accidental that it coincided with the globalization period. So those, in brief, are the extraordinary successes of this period. So what's gone wrong? And that's the second thing I want to talk about, that raises lots and lots of interesting questions, and they particularly relate, as you will see, to what's happened in developed countries. Some of it related to what I've just talked about, and some of it quite different. So the first thing that is, I think, very, very important is that we seem to be in an era of exceptionally low growth of productivity in the richest countries in the world. And ultimately, productivity, our capacity to produce with given resources, mainly in this case labor inputs, is the principal determinant, the most important single determinant of the standard of living in a country. Obviously, the distribution of income matters too, but other things being equal, fast growth of productivity will contribute much more than pretty well any conceivable redistribution. This chart comes from a great work by Robert Gordon on the US economic history, and what he shows in this is average growth of total factor productivity, which is the amount of growth which cannot be attributed to the accumulation of capital, human and physical. So it's the growth due to innovation. It's the best economics measure, very imperfect, of the growth due to innovation. And what he argues is that between 1920 and 1970, we had a staggering period of productivity. This is in the US, which has been the productivity frontier for the world economy for most of the last 140 years. It's the innovation hub of the world. 70 to 94 were miserable. We know there was the collapse. There was what many people thought was a real resurgence between 94 and 2004, much of it associated with the new IT and the internet. But the 2004 to 2014 period, and by the way, the same thing would apply if we looked at the last 2 or 3 years, has been absolutely miserable, right? The interesting thing is US performance, and this is a different measure of it, has been far and away the best of the major developed countries. The loss of productivity growth in the core countries of the West is probably the single most important reason why we all feel so miserable, because basically if GDP per worker isn't growing, particularly in aging societies, so the workforce is growing relatively slowly and the number of dependents is rising as it is now in most developed countries, then essentially people's living standards will only rise if there's redistribution, very large scale redistribution, and there isn't, so the result is most people are experiencing stagnant living standards. So this chart shows it's a fitted trend for successive fitted 10-year trends on the growth of labor productivity per hour for 5 pretty major developed countries. And I won't go through this long history, but what you will immediately see is everything's falling down to the right. And the other thing you will see is the US was about 0.9% in the decade up to 2016. It goes up to 2016. And the UK, in case you wondered, is down there with Italy at 0. So the biggest fact about what's gone wrong with capitalism is that in the developed world, it doesn't seem to be generating productivity growth anymore, and nobody really understands why. But it's incredibly significant. There is a huge debate we can get to in questions on whether this is a mismeasurement problem, but I promise you, and I've looked at all the literature on this, it isn't a mismeasurement problem. It's a small part of it, but it isn't the explanation for what is going on. It isn't true that we suddenly forgot how to measure productivity or IT or any of that in 2004. Okay? The second big thing that I have to talk about is what's happened to inequality. Now, this is just a level. The important point to note is that of these countries, a pretty large group of developed countries, and I could have a bigger group, it would all lead to the same result. The US and the UK are the most unequal. And I think it's not surprising, perhaps, therefore, that they are having some of the more severe populist symptoms. Interestingly, in the UK case, this is income, not wealth, income inequality rose almost entirely in the 80s. It hasn't worsened since then. It didn't worsen in the crisis, contrary to many people's views and expectations. In fact, it probably improved a little, but it got pretty high in the 80s and has remained so since. In the US, inequality has been rising pretty consistently since the 80s. Another indicator of this, which I think is quite intriguing, though the data for the UK are very partial, is from the Global Wealth and Income Database, which, and in this case I've taken the income shares of the top 10% for the US and such data as exist for the UK. And this is, I think, quite an interesting pattern. Nearly all developed countries for which there are data show a similar pattern, with the fascinating exception of France, which has seen no rise in inequality at all. I won't go into why that is so. And by the way, this is pre-tax income. I won't go into the effects of redistribution. They're clearly bigger for the US than the UK. The major point is that after the First and Second World Wars and the Great Depression, income compression at the top of the income distribution was very, very severe. It collapsed down to exceptionally low levels, dramatically so in the UK. And since then, and pretty consistently in the last 30 years, top income shares, the 10%, top 10%, top 1%, top 0.1%, have been growing very rapidly relative to the rest. So we are having a situation in which a really quite small proportion of the population have done much better than others. It's because of certain features of the Gini coefficient, which I looked at before, that this doesn't emerge so clearly over time for the UK. But it is pretty clear that on a number of different measures, inequality has got substantially greater in the developed countries over the last 30 years, which might not have mattered if real incomes on average were rising very rapidly, but for reasons that are already obvious, they haven't been. The third thing that went on during the global capitalist era in the developed world is a very large expansion in debt, which ultimately triggered, I won't say caused, I think it was a pretty powerful cause, an enormous financial crisis in 2007 to 9 in the developed world, and then another huge financial crisis in the Eurozone, after which debt stabilized overall with government debt expanding very rapidly as private sector debt started to shrink. And the rise in government debt, I don't have all the charts on this, has been very, very substantial. And the point here, which I think Larry Summers more than any other economist has made, but I was making similar points, not as wonderfully graphically as he did with his secular stagnation, resurrection of the secular stagnation hypothesis. The basic point he was making is that it appears to be the case that for the developed world, in the years leading up to 2007-8, reasonably sustained growth of demand required extraordinarily rapid rises in debt, particularly actually in the household sector and the financial sector. And when that bust, as I'll come to in a moment, we required extraordinarily heroic monetary policy to prevent the economy from collapsing. So we became very, very debt dependent, and that debt accumulation turned out to be unsustainable. I thought it would be useful to put this in because precisely when our debt exploded into crisis and we couldn't expand it anymore and our demand collapsed, and therefore the demand on which China depended weakened dramatically. China had to expand its domestic investment rate staggeringly, about 10 percentage point of GDP increase, and that was associated with and led to an absolutely colossal increase in China's debt, and that story is not yet over. We don't know where that is going to end up. I don't have the time to go into it. So clearly this global capitalist period had something to do with unsustainable accumulations of private sector debt, which then turned into government debt. The crisis hit, as I've indicated already. And how did we deal with the crisis? Why does it all feel so miserable? Well, the answer is we found it really, really hard to deal with this crisis. The global capitalist system, the global financial system, just didn't seem to work very well. In particular, in order to get the economy of the world growing again, we had to generate the most staggeringly expansionary monetary policy in the history of the world. And that's really a very significant fact about the frailties of our economy. So this is another one of my all-time favorite charts. It shows the Bank of England's base rate or bank rate, the rate at which the Bank of England lends overnight to banks since 1694. Why should you be interested in it going back to 1694? Well, mainly because this is where we've been in the last 10 years. For nearly 10 years, the Bank of England has been funding the banks at the lowest rate by far in its entire history, including 2 world wars, the Napoleonic War and the Great Depression. And the result of this, as in case you hadn't noticed, has not been hyperinflation. So the conclusion you reach is there is a deep and fundamental structural weakness of demand in our economies, and that's why Larry says we are in a secular stagnation. And since we still have the Bank of England's base rate is still 0.5%, today you can reach the conclusion that these conditions haven't ended. We're still in this period. And this shows the same thing for all the 4 major central banks of the developed world, the Bank of England, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, and the Fed, and their rates of interest over this entire post-crisis period. And you can see that the rates of interest have been extraordinarily low. In fact, for most of this period, the Bank of England's rate was the highest of these 4 banks. And in case you wonder how long this might go on for, I like to put this in. This is Japan, and Japan has been essentially the Bank of Japan has been offering free money to its banks for 23 years. And it still can't get inflation much above 0. Now that's really quite a significant fact about the way the market economy now operates, and it's really, really astonishing. So something is going wrong. What are the costs of the crisis we have experienced? Well, this is a few very simple of this breakdown: debt, crisis, ultra low rates, trying desperately to generate demand. So this line, the yellow line here shows what has actually happened to the aggregate GDP of advanced economies since 1979 for IMF data. The red line shows what would have happened if the pre-crisis trend had continued, goosed up as it was with the debt expansion. And the blue line, which you can read on the right-hand scale, shows how much, this is a 2020 forecast, actual GDP will deviate from trend GDP as a potential of the latter, as a portion of the latter. And the crucial point is that if the IMF is right, and it looks as though it'll be roughly right, GDP will be 1/5, 20% smaller by 2020 than it would have been if the pre-crisis trends had continued. And I, by the way, had yet to find any economic event in the last 150 years in the developed world, including the Great Depression, whose costs were as large as this. This is a massive shortfall. What this means is that all economic policy in our societies is about sharing out losses compared to expectations. And if you're sharing out losses compared to expectations being of continuing rises in living standards of the type we experienced before the crisis, you're going to make people very, very unhappy. This is what happened to GDP per head in the US and the Eurozone, just to give the comparisons. So the US and Eurozone had huge crises, massive declines in the 2008 and 2009. Then the US set off on a reasonable recovery, which was still the weakest recovery in US economic history since 1900. And the Eurozone, God bless it, had a second crisis. And so it's really had 6 years of crisis. Since then, it's been growing at about the same rate. But over the period since 2007 and 2017, GDP per head in the Eurozone has risen overall by 5%. Over 10 years, you do the math. It's essentially, it's saying that average growth of GDP per head in the Eurozone was less than 0.5%. No wonder people are so miserable. This is the proportion of households with flat or falling real incomes from wages and capital, estimated between 2005 and 14. It will be a little better since then, but not. So virtually all Italians, 80% of Americans households, 70% of British households, 70% of Dutch households, 63% of French, 65% of a weighted average of 25 developed countries had stagnant or falling real incomes. Something that no developed country had experienced since the 30s. Sweden is, I put it in because it's a happy exception to this rule. And of course, in addition to that, a number of countries experienced soaring unemployment. I've only gone up to 2017 here. You can see that while the UK had very rapid rises in unemployment, as did the US, they fell back down again reasonably strongly. Japan never had much unemployment. Germany did very, very well. But in Italy, in the Eurozone as a whole, and in France, unemployment became very high and has remained pretty high until recently. And of course, again, that's a reason so many people have been unhappy. This was a huge shock in terms of unemployment. And then there's been a lot of talk about austerity. Well, one way of thinking about austerity is the amount of structural fiscal tightening, cyclically adjusted fiscal tightening countries have done in the crisis. And this compared 2010 with 2016 when this sort of ended. And interestingly, the UK and the US had the largest fiscal tightening so measured of these countries. And the main reason for that is they had such enormous structural deficits after the crisis. Why? Very closely related to what I've been talking about. The financial sector was such an important source of revenue for these countries that when it imploded, revenue collapsed and the structural fiscal deficit emerged as so big. And as a result, the UK and the US had exceptional structural fiscal tightening. Italy much smaller because the financial sector basically didn't generate much income for the state. So again, the perception in the UK and US that austerity has been really rather large is correct. Okay, what does all this mean for democracy? Well, it means, I think, that we've got an awful lot of disappointed people who think that the people who ran their financial system, ran their governments, including their regulators and their central banks, are incompetent or crooked or both. And if people think that, they tend to get, one, very angry, and two, go for somebody who will promise to fix this in some simple and brutal way. Thus Donald Trump, or in a different context, thus let's get out of this ghastly EU thing, because something has to be done. And I think that's a very powerful force behind the recent events in British politics, in American politics, in Italian politics, where the establishment has been completely demolished politically, totally and absolutely demolished. And interestingly, the French have decided in a uniquely French way to have a political revolution which produces a centrist president. Whether that's the end of that word, I don't know. All established parties in France have been demolished. That's really important. The Republican Party, as we knew it, America, has been demolished. We are in a process of profound political upheaval. This is, of course, a politically sensitive point, but there's no doubt that one of the factors here has been another change clearly associated with globalization, which is a very large rise in a number of countries in the proportion of the population who are foreign born. So I've only got data for 2000 and 2013. There aren't more recent data. Germany would be much higher if we had the 2016 numbers because of the immigrants, the refugees who came in 2015. But you can see in Sweden, the UK, Italy, and interestingly Spain, there have been really, really large rises. And with the exception of Spain, a fascinating exception, the political salience of that has become very big. In Sweden, remarkably so, one of the most liberal social democracies in a very powerfully successful economy. So clearly immigration has been part of this. So electorates have got very unhappy, and the tragedy in my view is they've chosen policies that are going to make their fate worse. And I just want to discuss this and then I'll conclude. So this is what Brexit might mean. I think the overwhelming likelihood at the end of this process is that we'll end up with a free trade agreement rather like Canada's, though that won't solve the Irish problem because I don't think it can be solved, but I will leave that to one side. If that doesn't happen, I think we'll exit the EU without a deal at all. So it would be worse than this. So this is a chart put together by my colleague Chris Giles that takes a whole range of different analysts, with different models, of course, and different assumptions, to look at what the effect on the UK GDP might be if we have a free trade agreement rather than EU membership. So we move from EU membership to a free trade agreement like Canada's. And the blue dot shows their worst estimate, the red is their central, and the light blue is the best. Now, with the exception of Economists for Free Trade, which, as we know, has consistently said there will be no costs, indeed only benefits, even in the short term, which we now know definitively isn't true. So the basic point is that the worst estimate is minus 10%, and the other estimates cluster around minus 5 or so. Does that really matter? Relative to stagnant productivity growth, no, it doesn't. That's much more important. But assume productivity growth picks up very modestly, please God, to 1% a year, which will give trend growth to the British economy about 1.5% a year, which by 2030 will increase the British economy by what? 15 to 18%, something like that. Then a 5 percentage point, or even worse, a 10 percentage point loss is a big deal. It's a big deal. We will be significantly poorer as a result of making this shift than otherwise, and we're not growing very well anyway. So I think that the policies that the British public, in its wisdom, has chosen will make worse what they're already unhappy about. This is what the US has just done, and this is just another example of this. The US under Mr. Trump has chosen now to have a structural fiscal deficit basically of about 5% of GDP, which is about 2 percentage points bigger than it was going to be under the Obama administration's forecast. This implies a sustained and consistent rise in public debt. That will certainly be manageable. More important, however, with a 5% of GDP structural fiscal deficit and incredibly low national savings, the current account deficit of the US will worsen, the trade deficits of the US will worsen, the exchange rate in real terms will probably appreciate, monetary policy will tighten, and the very workers in industry who voted for Mr. Trump will lose their jobs even faster. So here are two examples of deeply counterproductive policy that result from anger and the appeal of demagogic promises. And if you talk to my Latin American friends, of whom I have many, they would say, well, duh, of course, we know all about that. We've been doing this for half a century, and it hasn't worked very well. It looks like Argentina, doesn't it? Let me just make clear the core point that I am making, because I don't have the time to go through all the detailed connections. For the world as a whole, and for a very large proportion of humanity, particularly in Asia, and increasingly actually in parts of Africa, but I haven't had time to go into this, the globalization era has been terrific. It has brought about a reversal of a 150-year trend, roughly, in which the developed countries, Europe and North America, get richer and they don't. And when I started working in the World Bank in the 70s, I did not expect this to happen. I hoped it would happen, but I did not expect it. And the scale on which it has happened is staggering and, of course, shocking. Shocking in the sense that it's caused shocks. The second point I make is partly for this reason, but in my view, even more because of colossal serial incompetence in the developed world. The developed world has allowed itself to grow much more slowly than it needed to, above all to become significantly more unequal than it needed to, and then to generate a stupendous and very, very damaging financial crisis with long-term consequences. The result of this is that for many people, as I've shown you, there have been long periods of stagnant and falling real incomes, and in America, in many parts of for many parts of the income distribution, this has been true for roughly a generation. And our politics show that. And if we don't respond, our politics will get worse. I hope without destroying the entire global economic system, which I believe will make us much, much worse off. Anyway, what has happened at the world, we have global and domestic challenges. So first, let's think about the global side. The world has been brought together by technology. The impact of humanity has radically increased. This necessitates an ability to deliver global public goods. It brings back to where I started. Financial stability, open trade, security, protection of the environment are global public goods. We are so interconnected, it's really difficult to deliver these things without some measure of cooperation among sovereign states, the Roderick point. No state can deliver these things on its own, not even a superpower. So we end up having to create supranational regimes to deliver a lot of this. But creating such regimes, while necessary, also creates a clash with any absolute notion of democratic sovereignty. So there are trade-offs here. If we're going to sustain the world, we have to operate globally within the context of national sovereignty, which is somewhat attenuated. But it may be necessary to go forward by loosening the constraints of international regimes in some areas. Trade, money is another example where we've already done that through floating exchange rates. And I really wonder whether the euro will survive as a system. But in other areas, like climate or cooperation on taxation, we are actually going to have to increase global cooperation. Now, to increase global cooperation effectively in the world where it's becoming so difficult, where we clearly have the drumbeat of war of various kinds, this isn't going to work without domestic economic and political reforms. Economic reform has to focus on accelerating productivity growth, which means raising investment radically and distributing the benefits of that growth more widely. I think one of the things we're going to have to think about is the way companies operate. Another is we're going to have to think about, I think inescapably, whether we like it or not, is redistributing income and wealth. Doing these things while retaining the benefits of global capitalism is going to be very challenging, and this too will require global cooperation, particularly on areas like taxation and competition policy, where larger units like the EU are much more effective than the British state. So very, very little on the policy challenges, but the main points are the ones I make. The global capitalist system has been a colossal success, and for many people it's been a substantial failure as they see it, and managing that stress, that contrast over the next 20, 30 or even 1 year is, I think, among the biggest challenges of our time. Thank you for listening.
I'd like to just start maybe, an amazing tour de force about the growth of Asia. You highlighted a lot of, you talked about the growth of debt, and of course we've had in the last few days, again, more analysis about the growth of consumer debt. So there's an obvious question, and I know you probably don't like to make predictions about where we're headed in a while. But let me just start with your last point about the redistribution of income. And what you feel some of the solutions are in that area, or whether about, changes in corporate governance. I mean, one thing that is attracting, of course, a lot of interest at the moment is the idea of a universal basic income, with the experiments in Finland and other places. I mean, what is your sense of whether that is politically feasible, whether those sorts of addressing the right questions? Maybe we start with that.
I think these things are incredibly difficult, partly because my view at the moment, and I'm trying to write a book about this, so I'm thinking it through, but I haven't got to the end, so people can suggest to me. I think that what countries can do has to work within their own political traditions and values, and they differ very radically. So policies that are relatively feasible for, say, Denmark, are not feasible for Britain, let alone America. And that's very relevant to the idea of universal basic income. The reality is that by the standards of OECD countries, in general, we, like the other English-speaking countries, by the way, are relatively low-tax countries. That's a political choice. I think it's much more than it's a political choice, and it seems to be a deeply ingrained one. We have always tended to be, with the exception of a brief period in the 70s, and of course the wars, which are exceptional, relatively low-tax countries. If you're a relatively low-tax country, universal basic income is not a feasible operation. And the reason for that is that if you're going to give an income to everybody, not through just tax allowances, but actual income, which is going to be adequate for people who are going to actually need to subsist on it, so doesn't make lots of poor people much worse off than we now have with a targeted distribution system, then there has to be an awful lot of churning. Basically, there has to be a tremendous amount of tax paid by people who are receiving this money. And that only works if you really have a very high average tax rate. So the average tax rate in the Scandinavian, I've just been looking at the Scandinavian countries, France is sort of 50% plus. Ours is 36. The big difference. Maybe 37, I can't remember. I think it's about 36. And so I think a universal basic income is an infeasible operation for us, even if desirable. And I think it's undesirable because I think in our system it's unnecessary. That is to say, at the moment, I'm not persuaded by the most important premise of the people who support universal basic income, which is that the income that people will obtain in work is so inadequate that something like this has to be imagined. So at the moment, at least, I'm still persuaded that the basic idea behind New Labour's tax credits is a better idea. It does give you higher marginal tax rates at the bottom. It's inescapable. You either have high marginal tax rate everywhere or very high marginal tax rates with more targeted systems. But if you want to help people whose earnings are really low, on the assumption that most people, the majority, will get a reasonable income from work, then, and you have a relatively low average tax rate, you have to target your spending. So I think tax credits are crucial in our sort of system to make redistribution work at all. And if you wanted to get away from that, then you would have to persuade the British electorate that on average their tax rates are going to go up by about 15 percentage points of GDP. And I think the chances of winning an election on that premise are zero, even for Mr. Corbyn. So, so I think one has to work within what... Now, the US has a bigger problem, which is their average tax rates are even lower, and they've just given away a lot more. So how they how they can manage their problems, well, basically they've given up. I think they can't. They're just stuck with what they have. And I think the rage cycle in America is now possibly unmanageable. But in our case, we have to do it in a different way. We can't do it through universal basic income. By the way, I think that the Scandinavians, apart from Finland, are not persuaded that this is the best way to go. The Danes don't go that way either.
I mean, we have, of course, seen a big, in Britain, we have seen a big increase in rise in the national minimum wage.
Yes.
Whether that's helping people because a lot of those people on minimum wage are probably in households with people who are not on minimum wage. So it could be helping people in the
standard analysis of the distributional effects of rises in the minimum wage, and particularly the so-called living wage, which is the analysis done by the IFS, suggests that it is extremely poorly targeted on the poorest. The biggest problems of poverty in our country, as far as I can see, are in households with significant numbers of dependent children, particularly households with a lone parent and significant numbers of dependent children. And a higher minimum wage doesn't do very much for these people. It does something, but not much. Compared with family credit of some kind, it's fairly weak.
You talked about the rise of Asia generally, but didn't talk much about China. And I mean, obviously, you know, leaving aside maybe some of the issues the sort of between the US and China, but I mean, in the bigger picture, I mean, what is your sense of where China is in terms of its thinking about the Western model and the state of capitalism in the West? And I mean, more narrowly, I mean, there's still a lot of money in China that will presumably, a wall of money coming our way. What will our own government do? I mean, will they be prepared to let China buy a lot of assets in this country?
These are some very, very big questions, and I think they're profound. So I've written a few pieces, one today actually, and one 2 weeks ago, on this, partly related to a series of seminars that I was at 4 weeks ago in China. I was invited with 4 or 5 other journalists and pundits, you'll know the names of all these people, to talk to Chinese leaders off the record about how they see the world. This is very clearly the view from the upper echelons of the party system. I mean, upper. So I understand very well that this is not a representative Chinese view, but still they're running the country, so what they think matters. And I've written this week, today actually, before I did my presentation for you, I did a column on what I think about what they said. So this is really, really interesting. They have concluded, I think, 2 things which may or may not be mistakes, but it's what they concluded. And on this, I think what they said was quite honest. And there were some other things where that did. The first is you know, you guys really don't know how to make democracy work, do you? You do choose some really strange people to run your countries, and you really do make some very strange decisions. Why don't you invest, for example? They just can't make up that. Why don't you invest? You know, they have worked out by now that, and it's becoming true, that their infrastructure is a hell of a sight better than that of America or Britain, which is quite remarkable. So they're not very persuaded now, and this was 15 years ago. I've been going to China once or twice a year. I don't claim expertise, but I've been going once or twice a year and spent significant times there for 25 years. And certainly their view of the competence of Western democracy has declined substantially. And in its attractions as a model, even privately, they don't talk about it. I mean, I've talked to people I know really well and are really attuned, really like the idea of democracy and have been educated here after the Cultural Revolution. They're old enough to have gone through it, and they say, yeah, of course we would like the idea of democracy, but it's a very difficult argument to make in China right now. The second point on capitalism, they like the idea of the market economy. They think it works rather well because it's worked rather well for them. Now, it's a very guided market system, of course, but they're basically concluded, I think pretty clearly, that the financial system is a wrecking ball. And they're not going to let the financial system do to them what it did to us. And I think that has two important implications. One, that financial liberalization will be very, very slow and very, very careful. And that might affect their growth significantly because they don't quite know how to manage. They make big mistakes too, and their debt problem is a real one. And the second thing, which is probably good from your point of view, is that they don't want floods of money to come out of China into the world. You will probably have noticed, if you've been following the papers, that the head of a company called Anbang has just been put in prison forever. And he was an unbelievably powerful Chinese billionaire, which counts for absolutely nothing. You know, that and several RMB will get you a cup of coffee, and being a billionaire amounts to zilch. It's very important to understand this, I think, about China. Money counts for nothing in terms of power when the state is really interested. He borrowed a vast amount of money in China from various disreputable, quasi-legal sources and bought colossal quantities of assets around the world. One of his purchases was here, I think, but I can't remember which it was. Anyway, the Chinese have decided they don't like what he did, and he's going to prison forever. And the point of that is to tell all the other guys who think that that might be a nice idea, that's not a good idea. So I think you can assume that the outflow of capital of that kind from China will be attenuated and will be very, very carefully regulated. Of course, at the other end, I haven't talked about that, most governments in the West, the UK is behind the others, have by now decided that they are not going to let their trophy assets go anywhere near Chinese ownership. And the most important country which has shifted on this in the last couple of years is not us, we haven't really shifted, or America, but Germany. The Germans have become very, very concerned that Chinese purchase of Mittelstand companies with frontier technology will end up with complete loss of the core strength of the German industrial system. And if you know the German view of the German industrial system, it ain't up for sale. Yeah. So I think that's another really... So I think more broadly that the heyday of global financial capitalism, at least as far as global is past. And I don't think the Chinese are going to let the sort of system emerge that we have allowed to emerge, rightly or wrongly.
Let's open it up for some questions. Yeah.
I'm Andrew McLeod. I'm a visiting professor here at King's. But I'd like to pick on 2 or 3 quick points and get your reaction, if I may. One is the issue of Japan and demographics. And I think one of the strong issues of 20 years of deflation in Japan is because of decreasing workforce participation, the ageing population and the depopulation of Japan, essentially because Japan won't open up to migrants. And until we can find a way of replacing those leaving the job market through retiring with entering the job market through migration, then we have real economic problems based on that demographic issue. And the last thing I'd like to say, or get your comment on, is one purely of communications. And the problem that I think we have, which you've not really touched on in democracy, is even the advocates of democracy are not engaging in public debate. So over the last 20 or 30 years, public debate's been given to the anti-democracy and anti-capitalism voices. And how do we re-engage the public debate about the positives?
On the last one, well, I wrote a whole book about it. I'm now focusing on the problems because we've got to sort them out. But I agree this is a profound issue. I think most people probably, I mean, it is clearly true, I think, that most people in the Western world would tend to regard the last 40 years, let's exclude the Canadians and the Australians from this because they are a relatively small proportion of this billion odd people, would view the last 40 years as not very satisfactory. I have many, many more charts on different aspects of deindustrialization. But I think that's broadly true, while clearly for an immense number of people around the world, it's been a striking success. And social attitudes surveys show this. I've just been looking at that today. In India and China, the general mood of people on all these social attitude surveys is much more optimistic because, even though they're much poorer on average, because things have been getting better so rapidly. So I don't know how you get this story over. And perhaps you can't persuade somebody who feels he hasn't done or she hasn't done so well in, say, Britain, that's all right because after all it's been fine in China. You know, that's part of my national sovereignty issue. You know, who are politics accountable? On the aging point, I think you struck what I think is actually a core issue, and it is related to the thing I've been thinking about a lot, which is the who are we question. To whose interest? How should democratic policies be conceived? Now, I'm going to make a suggestion which I think you might well disagree with, but I think it's probably not unimportant. And it clearly doesn't work perfectly because the US has become such an exception. But it seems to me that Canada and Australia, I assume New Zealand too, still see themselves, certainly I know Canada much better because I know Canadian politicians at the moment, still think of themselves as countries of immigration. The we is the people who are here and all the bright, talented, hard-working people from around the world who might come here. And that's and clearly in Australia it's not perfect because you know as well as I do that there is some amount of xenophobic backlash, but that seems to be the dominant temper, and it clearly is the dominant temper in Canada. If that's who you see the we are, then you have and you of course have lots of empty space, clearly in Canada, and lots of water, unlike you. You can say, okay, we got these problems. Immigrants aren't a problem; they're the solution. That's clear. It's surprising that the dominant temper in the US now, which wasn't the case when I lived there 20, 30 years ago, is not like that, because of course that's the history of the US. And it seems to me a reflection of profound failures of American policy, that they've shifted to a mode in which Mr. Trump can get elected, being the most pronounced xenophobe to get into the head of government of a major country in a lifetime. And that's very striking. Why isn't the US more like Canada? But those are the case. Now the problem Japan is the extreme opposite. The Japanese are very clear who we are. We are we, right? We're a tribe, and anybody else is not Japanese. Indeed, lots of the people who've lived in Japan for nearly a century, the Koreans, for example, aren't Japanese. So they can't cope with the idea of foreigners, and you're absolutely right. Because of that, they don't really know how to cope with immigration. And one of the factors that creates a problem for them, deflationary problem, demand problem, is of course this, but there are others. Interestingly, you see, one of the things that is not widely known, Japanese productivity performance has been quite good. Not bad at all, much better than ours. But it doesn't make much difference if the labour force is collapsing. Germany had a similar problem, and that's one of the reasons Angela Merkel thought immigration wasn't a bad idea. Italy is the worst case in Europe, and they really don't know what to do with it. Because they don't have a policy for immigrants, because they don't want to think about it, they end up with a problem in which immigrants overwhelm them. So Now, here you've got the broader problem in Europe. Britain, I think, is more complex. I don't want to get into the long subject of British relationship to immigration. Sometimes I think we do it quite well, and sometimes I think it gets problematic. But clearly, the European countries, all of the European countries, up till about, leave aside 1970, were countries of emigration, mass emigration. Lots of Australians came, apart from Britain, from Greece and Italy and all. They're immigrant countries. Shifting to thinking yourself as we're us and we go somewhere else, to thinking we're us and lots of strange people from the rest of the world come to you, that's an incredibly difficult shift. And most political leaders in Europe haven't known how to handle that, and they haven't known how to manage society to deal with that. And I would say that's still the case. Economically, however, you're clearly right that in many cases, not all, the fertility rates differ a lot across Europe. And ours is relatively high. In Northern Europe is generally relatively high, Sweden and so forth. But in Spain and Italy and Germany, the fertility rate is a catastrophe. It's like Japan. So if they don't accept immigration, they have a very, very big problem, possibly an insoluble one. And it's one of the problem then is they want more bodies, but they don't want foreigners. There's no way they can sort this out. So I do think immigration, and it's a third rail in politics, nobody wants to talk about it, is an absolutely core issue for the developed world, and we don't really know what to do about it, except the exceptional cases, I think, that you have mentioned, of countries which embrace the idea of immigration, which strangely excludes the US.
Thank you. We'll take one more question. Yeah.
Sorry, these are complicated questions. Ask simple questions.
Mark Wilson. Good evening. Thanks for your talk. You showed a great quote that essentially said, out of democracy, national sovereignty, and free trade, we can only have two. If you were able to choose 2 out of 3, which one would you lose? And furthermore, have we reached a stage in human development where our issues are so complicated and so interconnected that our democratic systems can't handle them anymore, which is why the Chinese system is so attractive now?
Well, my answer to the Roderick paradox, if it's a paradox, this trilemma, is like all trilemmas, they're very useful to pose, and as soon as you start thinking about it, the sensible thing is to have a bit of all three. So I refuse to have the choice because it's not realistic. But the trade-offs, that's why I stress the trade-offs. I think countries need a reasonable degree. If you've got a domestic political system at all, you have to have some range of issues, important issues, over which your polity can decide. So one of the reasons I was pretty consistently with one brief wobble against the euro was that it seemed to me likely that even if it was technocratically as workable, which is questionable, that it would at some point create a head-on clash between the constraints created by the euro system and democracy. And that's exactly what the Italian election is about. Now in Greece they did solve that problem fairly simply by just throttling them. But in the case of Italy that will be much more difficult. So the first thing is, don't overdo the global regimes. Try and concentrate the global regimes where you really need them. And I think there are areas where we have developed global regimes beyond where it really makes sense. And that's also, I think, true in trade, to some degree. Not because I'm not in favor of free trade, because I am, but because if you impose it from outside, you further limit people's choices. So to come back to another issue, since we've been talking about migration, my own personal view is that allowing Britain to have some carefully controlled ability to manage inflows of labour workers from the EU would for the EU and for the UK have been a reasonable price for keeping Britain in the EU. That seems to me the case. And the consequences of not being able to agree that, though we went about it in a terrible way, are bad for everybody, including, of course, the countries that emigrate, which produce large numbers of immigrants. So the answer is I would give countries more sovereignty. But I certainly don't want to argue that countries should do whatever they want, because it has radical effects on other countries. And we share the world in many areas. And there are areas where we're clearly going to only be effective if we cooperate. Climate change is the most obvious one. But I think it's actually true in tax too. If we're going to be able to tax corporations at all, we're going to have to cooperate, and we are cooperating. And that's international regimes again on tax information and all the rest of it. These are powerful tax information. Now you've asked finally a different question. Which is, can democracy be made to work? Well, the answer is, yeah, why not? Of course it can be. But I've now come to the view that there are some processes that have to be rethought. And I'm not absolutely sure how. The core issues, I think, in making democracies work better. Three. The first question, the issue is there any way of internalizing a degree of long-termism in decisions in a democratic system? It seems to be very, very difficult now, and that's related to the investment point that I made. Still, I find it absolutely bewildering that when we had this immense crisis here, enormous recession, we halved public investment. I mean, just extraordinary thing to have done, just extraordinary. So that's the first issue. The second really deep issue, which the Chinese would go on about forever, is how you relate the obvious technical complexity of many of the policy decisions you have to make with popular vote. Popular decision making. I mean, you think of the whole range of decisions we have to make on pension policies, on urban planning, all these sorts of things. These aren't issues that you can just throw, or health, public health, or you throw out the whole machinery of technocratic knowledge and experience. I mean, operating an economy like ours in which we really don't trust the experts, or a system like, we're really in terrible trouble. So that's the second really big issue. Can we recreate some real space for technocratic decision making? And the final thing, which seems to me hugely important, more in the US than here, though I think it's everywhere, is the role of special interests, and particularly moneyed special interests in democracy. So I think I would like to believe that we can make this system work better, and I think autocracy has gigantic flaws too, which I've written about quite recently. So I still hope and believe that democracy can do a hell of a lot better, but we have some pretty big challenges on these fronts, and I'm not sure that at the moment we know how to fix them.
That's probably a really good place, maybe a sober place to end. But thank you so much, Martin, for covering so much ground tonight and launching our Thought Leadership series. So we're delighted that you came, and thank you very much indeed.
Great pleasure.